Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. I did a video on accents and different accents when we're learning, and so I want to follow that up with a video about pronunciation. How do we get a good accent, as it's sometimes called? The main thing in pronunciation is to be understood and to speak clearly. So we don't have to sound like a native, but the native is the model that we want to imitate. We want to try to get close to the way natives pronounce, because after all, that's the model. I don't want to pronounce English like a Spanish person or a French person. I want to pronounce it like an English person. That's the language, that's the standard. We learn how they use words, and we learn to be as close as possible to how they pronounce. But we aren't going to sound like them. Now, how do we achieve it? In my view, you have to do a lot of listening, and you have to be very attentive. And I find when I start a new language, at first I can't pronounce the new sounds. I have a vague sense of what they are, but after a lot of listening, it becomes easier. So I can always pronounce much better 3 months in or 6 months in than I can at the beginning. So like right now, I've had a bit of exposure, been dabbling a bit in Polish, and I discovered that they have nasal sounds there. So that money, for example, is pronounced pieniądze. Pieniądze. When I first heard that, I thought, well, it's not written pieniądze, at least to me, but in fact, in Polish, it's written pieniądze. So I have to get used to how that word is pronounced. I have to listen to it over and over and over again. It's very important to listen, and to listen to things that we like and that we find interesting, that have resonance, and to pay attention. So if we look, for example, at the case of Sweden, I was going to say it's very important to listen to authentic native speakers. I think it's very bad, it's very unfortunate that most language learners are in a classroom listening to other language learners and non-native speakers. And very often, people of the same language group. So French speakers are surrounded by people speaking with a French accent. Japanese speakers are surrounded by people speaking with a Japanese accent when they're learning English. So they shouldn't listen to those people. They should listen to native speakers. And hopefully, not just some boring stuff, but something of interest. And that's what we see in Sweden, where people learn English primarily because of their exposure to television, movies, and pop culture in English, to something that they like and they find interesting. And therefore, Swedes pronounce English very well, the present generation. Whereas I would imagine a previous generation, 2 generations ago, that didn't have that exposure, would have more of a Swedish accent when they speak English. And because the Swedes now growing up aren't getting their English from their classmates, they're getting English from movies and television and so forth and so on. So it's very important to do a lot of listening to authentic content. One other thing, when we first start into a language, there's a lot of things we don't hear. So I often hear people say, well, should I learn, Spanish from Spain or Spanish from Mexico? For the longest while, it doesn't matter. You can't hear the difference. If you're learning, learning Polish, there's probably 4 or 5 different regional accents. I won't be able to pick them up. It really doesn't matter to me. At some point, though, as I've gotten used to the language, and it's kind of fuzzy, so I have a broad sense of how it's pronounced, I may find certain people whose voice and whose pronunciation and whose diction and the subject matter interest me, so then I will really concentrate on listening to those people and trying to imitate them. Now, in order to imitate, you have to notice, and you can't make assumptions about how things are pronounced based on your own language. So in Japanese, I often mention the case that Canadians go to Japan. When I was in business there, and I introduced Mr. Kato, and they say, hello, Mr. Kato, because K-A-T-O should be Kato. My father used to say the Bank of Nova Scotia instead of Nova Scotia. He would say word for word and squirrel for squirrel, whereas it's word and squirrel. So he's trying to interpose or impose the values of those letters from Czech, in his native language, onto English, instead of listening and being attentive to how those things are pronounced in English. I'm not a great believer in the International Phonetic Alphabet. I think to me it's more a matter of finding a voice, an accent, a person, an authentic native speaker that you like, subject matter is interesting, like Kim Young-ha, the Korean podcast that I've been listening to. I love listening to his voice. I love his intonation. I'm going to listen to him, and I'm going to model myself in Korean on Kim Young-ha. Model yourself, focus on listening, and don't worry about how you sound, because you are going to get better if you allow yourself to be exposed to the language. And the other thing is you have to want to be one of them. I think there's a large sort of psychological, emotional aspect to pronouncing. If you hang back because you're reluctant to you don't want to be a fool, so you sort of hang back in your own pronunciation, or in my own case, I'm comfortable speaking Spanish. When I go to speak Portuguese, I find myself hanging on to my Spanish rather than just totally throwing myself into pronouncing the way the Portuguese do, whether it be in Portugal or Brazil. So you really have to take that plunge, just let yourself go and do a lot of listening. So I think if we do those things, and we don't need to worry, we don't have to do all our listening. I do so much listening and reading when I learn a language. Not all of the listening that I do is to people whom I want to be like. Some of it I'm listening to for the content, for the language, to acquire vocabulary. But then there's some of it where the voice is so nice, the pronunciation, intonation is so nice. That's what I really focus on. That's what I imitate insofar as my pronunciation is concerned. So I hope that's helpful. Again, I also caution that we aren't going to sound like a native speaker that in most cases we can aspire to, but we shouldn't be disappointed if we don't reach that level. And I'm far more impressed by people who speak with an accent but speak well and have a good use of vocabulary than I am with people who seem to have very native or almost native-like pronunciation, but who can't really express themselves eloquently or precisely in the language. So there you have it. Just to follow up on that previous video about accents, is just thought I'd throw in one on how to achieve a native-like or close to native-like accent, or what we might call pleasing pronunciation in a language. Thank you for listening.